to offer children who move a lot or a little tips for succeeding in the next place that they live. And part of that has to do with the age of the child.
In my study, I found that when kids were moving to really different neighborhood contexts, that older and younger kids sort of approached making new friends differently. Younger kids had an easier time of it. They found that simple commonalities, like in my Baltimore study, a love of the Ravens football team was enough to begin to connect with a peer and then build a friendship from there. Older movers were more cautious in that adolescent stage about making new friends. As kids get into those older ages, they're looking for their peers to be people they can really trust and rely on. Adolescents turn to their peers for social support more. Younger kids are still turning to their parents a lot for that kind of resource. So it means that adolescents are making decisions about who it is they're going to spend time with and who it is that's going to be a friend. At a slower pace, they're being more cautious, trying to find the people that they really connect with and feel like they can trust.
Let's target that age group of adolescents. If they move to a place and they don't have lots and lots of friends, what can mom and dad do?
So I think it's important to think about finding places where you can give your teenager or your adolescent an opportunity to connect with same-age peers. Finding the things that you know that they're interested in and facilitating their access to spaces where they can find other kids who share those interests. So whether that's community centers or sports teams, maybe they're really interested in church youth groups, any kind of space that is going to help them connect with the peers that live in their new neighborhoods, encouraging them to find things at school that they're interested in and that they like. And I feel like finding those activity spaces where there's some structure and maybe some adult supervision too is another way to help really facilitate your kids finding positive peer relationships that have a focus and get them engaged in something that they can sort of pursue with passion. So I think it's about helping them find their peer spaces. So it's not mom and dad, it's finding the things that are their interests and then giving them an opportunity to activate those interests in the new space that you're living in.
For the little kids who are much more straightforward in their approach to potential friends, what would you advise parents to do with them?
I think parents can do the same kind of things with their younger kids, finding spaces where they can meet peers. In my study, I found that when kids were moving into suburban neighborhoods, sometimes there were fewer kids playing outside. More often kids play in the backyard instead of the front yard. So you might move to a new neighborhood and it seems like there's no kids at all. Once school started, it was easier to find kids. Like one student talked about thinking there was nobody that lived in his neighborhood, and then the first day of school, all these kids came out to the bus stop and he's like, where have you all been, right? And then he started to find these common things, and then his parents were letting him play with those other peers out in the neighborhood and inviting them to come over and sort of helping facilitate his capacity to build those social ties. So once your kid is identifying people they want to spend time with, really helping facilitate their capacity to do so is a way to help younger kids who are already willing to build those friendships on informal things like a love of football or dance or cheerleading or something like that, and finding ways to help them spend time with those kids.
Inner-city Baltimore, where the houses are right up on the street, people sit on the front stoop and carry on conversations. Then you go to suburbia and everything shifts to out of view. How can that impact the kid?
It's just part of being in a really different kind of environment. And lots of kids make moves where there's a dramatic change in their context. And this study was one of those, moving from an inner city neighborhood in Baltimore into a suburban community. It was surprising to kids that there weren't as many people who just played outside in the street. And I think it was something that they didn't anticipate, and many of their parents didn't either. So recognizing what's different about that space and then finding those areas where you're like, you know what, it might be harder for my son or daughter to make friends in this space because there aren't 15 kids outside playing street hockey every day. And then recognizing that you might need to help them find those organized activities where they can meet new people, or once they start finding peers who do live nearby, really saying, great, I'm so glad you've met someone. Let me meet their parents. Let's find ways for you guys to be able to spend time together and facilitating their capacity to do that.
So is that a more organic and child-friendly process where they're naturally out in the front, in the street, on the sidewalk, hitting a ball, whatever, to come together rather than in suburbia, it's quite often it's a forced togetherness?
Sometimes I do think that kids are participating in more structured activities in suburban spaces, and partially that may be because structured activities often have a cost associated with them. So for low-income families, it might be hard, and you have to recognize that you need to find things that are inexpensive or affordable for your family, and there may be differences in suburban spaces compared to urban spaces in the number of things that are free or low cost, which can impact your capacity to get involved in structured activities. But I found that for the younger kids in particular, many of them were making friends through unstructured activities. So it doesn't have to be a structured sports team or something like that for them to be able to build these relationships. It's just about spending time with other kids. So lots of them meeting friends at school and then being able to go back to the neighborhood and play together outside was enough for them to start to build those relationships. So structured activities are one great avenue to go, but even just facilitating your child's capacity to engage with their peers in their neighborhood space in a way that you as a parent feel comfortable is a good way to help facilitate their capacity to make friends.
In your study, contextually speaking, if the kid met someone at school that he was interested in befriending, if they crossed over and they were in the same neighborhood, that was also very helpful.
Right, so in Baltimore City there's a lot of school choice, which means that oftentimes kids might attend a school in their neighborhood, but other kids would attend schools not in their neighborhood, choosing to go somewhere that was a little bit different. In suburban spaces, many more kids are attending their zoned public schools, which meant that it was often that the kids that went to school with you also lived nearby in your neighborhood. So it was easier for kids to maintain their friendships both in the school space and in the neighborhood space because pretty much everybody that went to school with them lived relatively close by. So I think finding those kids that you can connect with and being able to spend time with them in multiple spaces, the more time you spend with someone, the better you get to know them. So it's always helpful, I think, when kids have the capacity to engage with their peers in multiple contexts. It can help strengthen their friendships.
What year did you do this study?
We started talking to kids with this study in 2012. And so this paper is based on interviews that we did with students in 2012 and 13.
From 2012 to 19, now technology's come in. You were talking about the importance of just spending literal quantitative time with each other. How important is that?
I think it's critical. You can maintain friendships or stay connected to people via text or on social media, but there's something about forming a friendship when you actually spend time together that gives you more common ground, more things to talk about, helps you build that relationship and strengthen it. And so I do think for kids, being able to be together and spend time together is a really important thing.
The kids that moved from inner city Baltimore were reliant upon hanging out with certain people that they knew wouldn't put them in physical or life-threatening danger. So how did they transfer that set of skills into the more affluent suburbia?
I found, especially among adolescents that were moving from really high poverty neighborhoods where there was more frequent violence in their neighborhoods, that they were cautious about making friends, in part because they wanted to make sure who they were spending time with were people that they could trust and people that they trusted they would be safe with. So when they moved even into suburban communities where they articulated that their neighborhoods were safer spaces, they were still maintaining a cautious approach, right? Wanting to make sure that the kids that they chose to spend time with were people that they felt like they could trust. And all teenagers do this, right? Regardless of space, you want to be with somebody that's not going to talk behind your back, that isn't going to, turn around and tell somebody something bad about you. So you're looking for people that you connect with and people that you can trust. But I think for these kids in this study in particular, there was that added layer of having come from high poverty spaces where there was the risk of violence that was present in many of the neighborhoods they moved from, and that just put an added layer on top of the way in which they were very cautious about making new friends.
As the children in the less affluent neighborhoods moved in, they were just as concerned about that element of trust as the other direction. Can I trust that person? Because they lived in a high crime area. How do you get people sort of past that and seeing people for what they are, not, what they own?
I think what's interesting about the housing voucher program that I studied is that families are just renting private units the same way that anybody else would rent a unit. So it isn't like, you're moving into something and everybody in the neighborhood or everybody in the school knows that your family has moved with a voucher. So in many instances, it really just is about being new to the neighborhood and making friends. So I think some of what I find in this study reflects the experience of kids who are making a dramatic change in their neighborhood context, regardless of the circumstances that fit with why you're making that dramatic change in your neighborhood context. But that for most kids, when you make that kind of move, the biggest concern is making new friends and fitting in. And that when you're able to do so and build positive peer relationships, they can really pull you in and help you feel like you belong in those spaces, help you feel connected to your school, and encourage your participation and engagement with the resources in your new community, with your teachers in your new school. So I think it's just about understanding that with a big change comes this challenge. And that these kids are negotiating that just like any other new mover into a new community.
Parents, when they move, are concerned about finding a new set of doctors, figuring out where the grocery store is. What do they really need to be thinking about with their kids and really be concerned with?
Anytime you move to a new place as a parent, you have to find where your kid's going to go to school, and you sort of sort that process out. And then I think often you're like, okay, we've done that. My kid is going to go to this school. They'll meet peers in that space. And in many respects that's true. They are going to have access to peers in that space. But especially if you're moving like early on in the summer or at a point in time where they won't immediately have access to those peers, it's worth putting on your to-do list as you're moving to think about other places in your new community where you can find opportunities for your child to connect with other peers of a similar age. So finding the free summer camps or the library activities or other kinds of things where they can meet other students, other kids, is worth really thinking about, especially if you're making a really big move as a family. So when you move a short distance or you move somewhere in the same city nearby, chances are you can still let your kid have play dates with people they already know. When you move across the country, as the military often do, or in the context of my study, when you move pretty far across the metro area into a neighborhood where you're far enough away that it is hard to sort of have your kid continue to spend time with their social ties from the old neighborhood, their peers from the old neighborhood, then it's really important to also be thinking about how to help them make new friends in your new community.
Just be aware is sort of the message to the parents.
Yeah. And I think as a parent, you obviously want your child to feel like they belong in this new space and that they fit in and are making new friends. And so just thinking about finding the places where you might be able to help them connect with other people is a good thing to sort of put on your big move to-do list.
What are the age and race of participants and any other notable sample characteristics?
The program that we're studying is geared towards helping low-income families move. So the voucher recipients that we spoke to were all low income, and in Baltimore, Maryland, there's a very large Black population in the city, and so most of the people who are participating in this program are African American, and the entirety of our sample of 79 youth was African American. So it may be that some of these processes will look a little bit different in different places or with different groups of students. But in general, I think the overarching takeaway of kids really being worried about fitting in and making new friends when they move is something that applies across the board.